Hi, I'm Tom. This video is going to be a lore and hobby episode, probably mostly a lore episode, about the structure of the mortal forces of the Imperium during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. Why am I making a lore episode on this topic? I'm currently turning my very first 40k Imperial Guard army into a playable force in the Horus Heresy using the Imperialis Militia army list, fielding them as a mixed regiment of Imperial Army soldiers with a theme set around the Siege of Terra. I got two previous videos on this topic and I have linked them in the description and the cards if you are interested in the details of the project. Because I am making this project, I wanted to educate myself on how the Imperial Army and the Solar Auxilia works, what they are, and what the Excertus is. I'm probably like many of you when we read or listen to the Heresy era books. We focus on the marine characters and skip past all the fancy words and descriptions when it concerns the regular, unaugmented human soldiers. So the lore I present to you here is a compilation and consolidation of what I have learned from reading through the following sources. And I thought I might share what I found while you watch me kit bash and paint another 15 infantrymen to complete my first 20-man militia infantry squad. Later on in the video I will also update and slightly repaint my 40k cultists and some poxwalkers to the same standard, style and basing, so that they can be mixed into the militia force and look right at home when I play the army with different loyalties and provenances of war. Let us get on with the lore for this video. The story of the Imperial Army, and thus the militia, and later the Solar Auxilia, starts on Terra. During the Unification Wars, men and women served alongside the Emperor and his Thunder Warriors, or in some cases, against him. Once Terra had been conquered, these regiments would form the core of the newly constituted Imperial Army. These original regiments would in time be known as the Old 100. Many of these regiments would eventually be given settlement rights and then in time spawn newer generations of regiments formed in the original's image. Other regiments would continue to crusade. Some were allowed to recruit along the way, others, such as the ones who had originally fought against the Emperor, would not be allowed to do so and would thus eventually be extinguished. As the Unification Wars gave way to the Great Crusade and the scale increased ever onwards, so too did the institutions and the organizational structures of the Imperium. The main organization that we will focus on when it comes to the Imperial Army is the Excertus Imperialis. The Excertus Imperialis is the grand military support structure of the Imperium during the Great Crusade. The Excertus encompasses all of the Imperium's mortal military forces, made up of billions and billions of second line and support troops, support officers, void crew, logisticians, and the list goes on. I will mention a bit of a lore conflict between almost all sources and then the Age of Darkness rulebook that more or less says that the fleet is separate under the Armada Imperialis, but almost all established lore says otherwise, and we will continue with the lore as such. But I thought I would mention the discrepancy anyway. Officially, the Excertus is under the control of the Officio Militaris on Terra, but in a practical sense, they were under the command of the War Council, and especially the Primarchs, but also able to be called upon by many other organizations like navigator houses or planetary governors. It is a time of empire forging and exploration. Chains of command and organizational structures are constantly being tested and adjusted during this period. An example of this is the Departamento Munitorum that we know from 40k. The Departamento Munitorum is the munitions and supply wing of the Adeptus administration in the 41st millennium. The Departamento Munitorum was introduced by the Council of Terra shortly before the Solar Crusade, replacing the Corps Logisticae, which was a division of the Naval Administration. Lots of nerdy trivia like this can be found when you dive deep enough into the old books. Anyway, the main portion of the Excertus is the Imperialis Auxilia, or as we more commonly know it, the Imperial Army. The term Imperial Army sounds like it is a uniform thing with a cohesive structure, but really it is incredibly varied, as I will hopefully highlight to you during this video. But we can assign some structure to the Imperialis Auxilia. We really have 3 tiers of army regiments. The Solar Auxilia, the Void Specialized Elite Troops, the Crusading Regiments, and the Imperialis Militia, which is essentially planetary defense forces. The Solar Auxilia, I will spend quite a bit of time on their lore, as it is the most fleshed out, and as you will see, it is a pattern of regiment that has a defined structure. These guys also have their own rules for the game. The militia are locally raised regiments on newly compliant worlds, raised for the purpose of ensuring that the planet doesn't succumb to rebellion and to protect against alien invasions before more forces can be called in. These guys do have rules, and I have already looked a bit at them in past videos, but I will continue to do so in the future as I build out my force. We also have a fair bit of lore here, but it is intertwined with the others, as you will see. The Crusading regiments are harder to define. That name isn't official either. It is just what I've chosen to label the vast part of the Imperial Army that went out on crusade, but isn't a solar pattern cohort. And we do have some numbers on this from the old Heresy 1.0 black books. Here we are told that by the 2nd century of the Great Crusade, solar pattern regiments amounted to 20 to 25% of the overall Imperialis Auxilia's void-faring first-line armies. So by that logic, the inverse of 75 to 80% of the crusading regiments of the Imperial Army are not Solar Auxilia. In the Horus Heresy books, we find a lot of references to some of these crusading regiments. For instance, some of the Old Hundred, such as the Tupolev Lancers, or probably the most well-known, the Lucifer Blacks. A regiment that, by the way, still exists in 40k, guarding the Imperial Palace, no less. There are no real rules for these types of regiments. Well, not in name, but you can definitely either use the Solar Auxilia rule set or choose some of the more elite provenances of war from the militia rule set to represent these kinds of regiments. So we now roughly know what the Excertus is. And we also know that there are sort of 3 tiers of soldiers that all fit under the same name, the Imperial Army, or Imperialis Auxilia if you prefer. We also need to know how the Imperial Army fits into the larger picture before we get into the details of each of these tiers and their fate after the heresy. The Astartes were the spearhead of the Imperium's military, delivering the hammer blow of the Crusade, toppling leadership and strong points, but alongside them served the Imperial Army in a support capacity where they were able or allowed to support the Astartes, or by holding conquered worlds after the Astartes has swept through. As the Crusade spread out from Terra and the Astartes were spread more thin, some expeditions would be led by the elite regiments of the Imperial Army, the Solar Auxilia. So let us start with the Solar Auxilia, as it is the most well-defined both in universe and also in the lore books. It also ties in with the others as part of their story, and we will have something to compare the militia and the crusading regiments with after we are done learning about the Solar Auxilia. Solar Auxilia cohorts. As the name suggests, the Solar Auxilia has its roots in the solar system. Unlike other proud regiments, such as the Old Hundred, the Solar Auxilia is a pattern of regiment, with the structures, tactics, traditions, and experiences from Terra's thousands of years of warfare merged with the void expertise from the highly militarized tech enclaves of the Saturnine Ordos. The first 10 regiments are collectively known as the Saturnine Rams, but were more or less just Saturnine Void Hoplites, reorganized and expanded. The parameters of their creation were exact and reads as follows. The raising of a large body of frontline soldiers whose principal theater of war would be the void and hostile environments of all kinds, both to support the Legiones Astartes in battle and by deployment freedom from concentrated frontline operations. In Imperial records, Solar Auxilia cohorts are designated as a heavy expeditionary force or heavy void infantry formation. With the Astartes being the hammer of the Great Crusade, the Solar Auxilia were the pathfinders and watchmen, garrisoning warships and frontier outposts, as well as supporting the Astartes or serving in their stead if none were available. One of the standards of the Solar Auxilia are their void carapace, reinforced fully enclosed environmental suits, based upon the void hoplites of the Saturnine Ordo. The armor is self-sealing and resistant to some small arms, as well as resilient to radiation and thermal effects. Even their vehicles are environmentally sealed with internal life support systems. Even the Mars Solar pattern of Leman Russ tank, created to fit the Solar Auxilia's specifications and with superior quality of materials, usually reserved for Legion war machines. Often these war machines would be fitted with brass, bronze or copper decorations, which will be kept shining as a matter of pride. This act of post-battle cleaning came from the Saturnine Ordo as a way to ensure that microfractures or hidden damage would be detected and thus maintaining their environmental seal. I love these little bits of lore, and they made me understand why it is easier to deal with a Imperialis Militia Leman Russ than a Solar Auxilia version. Better materials and maintenance. The rule that I'm referring to here is in the Militia PDF, and it more or less says that a glancing hit on a Militia vehicle will be upgraded to a penetrating hit. Not only are the Solar Auxilia extremely well trained and equipped for mortal formations, but they offer the mortal armies a way of fighting in void war zones, hazardous environments, and any transitions from void to ground combat. Speaking of training, Solar recruitment is among the strictest there is for mortals. Intelligence and physical aptitude tests must be completed in order to serve and carry the equipment of the Solar Auxilia. Aspirants who fail these tests will instead serve as naval ratings or in less selective Auxilia formations. Their role during the Great Crusade were many, either as a pioneer force accompanying rogue traders, as void-faring guardians of newly conquered systems, or as support for Astartes spearheads, or as substitution for Astartes if none were in the expeditionary fleets they served as part of. As mentioned earlier, expeditionary fleets, which did not feature any substantial Legiones Astartes presence, would typically be led by a corps of Solar Auxilia, led by a Lord Marshal or Lord Militant Imperialis, appointed by the Imperial War Council. Lords like this would often be given the right to become commanders of new imperial colonies, or in some cases be given a warrant as a rogue trader. Once a system has been conquered, the Solar Auxilia would remain to guard the newly conquered worlds from threats without as well as rebellion from within. Only when compliance was fully achieved would they oversee the creation of a local Imperialis Militia force and then rejoin the Great Crusade once more. As the Crusade and its endless need for manpower increased, the Sol system could not keep up with the demand, and the template of the original Solar regiments was implemented on newly conquered worlds, especially those systems who had an affinity for void warfare. A typical raising of a new Solar pattern regiment was done by taking experienced officers and non-commissioned officers from existing regiments, letting them form the backbone and culture of a new regiment of recruits. Retirement was also an option that was available after 30 years of service in the Solar Auxilia, and the reward will be a full citizenship, land, money, and position on a newly founded colony world. If, however, the soldier or officer opts to do another tour, instead of retiring, they will be rewarded with rejuvenation treatments that extend their lifespans. Early Solar Auxilia regiments were composed in the fashion of the Principia Bellicosa, of 5,000 soldiers at arms, led by a legate colonel, and around 300 officers and specialists. Later on, a Solar cohort muster would consist of 120,000 individuals, and several thousand additional support staff, all under the command of a Marshal Solar. All of this would be broken down into sub-cohorts of 1,200 men, led by a legate commander, or sub-commander. Here is an example of the disposition of a regiment of this size. During the Heresy, most of the original Solar regiments stayed loyal to the Emperor, but many of the later foundings were found on both sides of the conflict. Now that we have a baseline to compare the rest of the Imperial Army to, we can return to the less elite mortal soldiers of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy once more. The Imperialis Auxilia, the Imperial Army, The part that isn't a Solar Auxilia pattern regiment, as we just discussed, was as varied as the worlds they were raised on. Traditions can vary greatly, some organizations tracing its roots back to the Age of Strife, and some will be recently conscripted as a last desperate resort. Their motivations for joining the Emperor and the Great Crusade would also be varied greatly. According to the Imperial Guard 4th edition Codex, the earliest instance of the Imperial Army would be a wide variety of men drawn from different worlds, adventurers, mercenaries, idealists, undesirables, xenophobes, primitives, and opportunists. Like with traditions and motivations, armor is equally varied. Some may march into battle in semi-powered carapace, where others only in simple clothes of furs and hides, and the same goes for their weaponry. In terms of equipment, most of the equipment were locally produced, such as small arms and personal gear. But when it comes to vehicles, most regiments are supplied from the Imperium's strategic reserves, as very few worlds are capable of manufacturing the heavier vehicles of the Imperium's armies. As such, it is possible to see a feral warrior in furs and tribal tattoos while manning a Baneblade super heavy tank. Many of the regiments would be raised as Imperialis Militias to serve as planetary defense forces, as we know them from 40k. But many of them would likewise be raised to be support troops to expeditionary fleets in the endless need for manpower in the conquest of the galaxy. In practice though, militia forces consist of a core of professional soldiers supplemented by a number of conscripted men and women, serving for a period of time as needed. The officers and sergeants are typically professional soldiers or even veterans of the Great Crusade, adopting a new role in a local defense force, and thus their experience and skills continue to serve the Imperium. There are of course also prisoners or abhumans who did not warrant immediate extermination, who could be pressed into service against their will, led by veterans and discipline masters. Militia forces, unlike the rest of the Imperial Army, are not subject to the chain of command of the Excertus Imperialis, even though it is under it in terms of organizational structure. Rather, militias are under the command of the local imperial commander or planetary governor. During the heresy, militia forces fought on both sides. Many worlds would raise even more regiments to halt the traitors or aid them. In The Lost and the Damned, chapter 25, we hear about Katsuhiro's company, who was merged with other formations 3 times already, and this was early in the Siege of Terra. They are described as being as dirty and as mismatched as their enemies, and only the direction that they are facing told who was on which side. And this description is more or less the exact theme of my ongoing Imperial Army conversion project that is running in the background and linked to in the cards and description. Katsuhiro was conscripted into the Kushtun Naganda, one of the Old 100, during the defense of the Imperial Palace. Among the traitors, the lives of the militia would be spent in the billions, and the survivors would often be the most bloodthirsty and ruthless among them, worshipping their Astartes overlords as demigods, or be in warp-worshipping cults, succumbing to mutation and insanity. In Heresy 1.0, there was even a special army list for playing these warp cults, who could often be found alongside the likes of the Word Bearers. These types of warp cults can also be represented using the militia rule set for 2.0. So that is more or less the lore we have for the Imperial Army in the sources that I have available to me. However, I felt like we should have the full story of the regular human soldiers of this time period. And you've probably read about these last ones in the Heresy books, or even in 40k, where they also feature quite heavily when Marines are concerned. You've probably heard about the Prosperine Spire Guard, the Chthonian Headhunters, or the Ultramar Auxilia. These are some of the examples of Legiones Auxilia, mortal soldiers in the service of one of the legions, or later on, chapters. Sometimes they may also be referred to as armsmen or serfs, depending on the author or legion or chapter. Serfs also encompasses other roles than fighting men, but that is not in the scope of this video. As the Great Crusade went on, ties between the legions and the accompanying Solar Auxilia cohorts grew stronger and stronger. Sometimes this led to the Solar Auxilia forces foregoing their duties or assignments to other critical tasks to instead do the bidding of the legions. This was to the annoyance of the Excertus command, and in 845 M30, the Divisio Militaris formally ratified the Praecepta Inductionis, allowing the legions to induct solar cohorts into the legions, but that they would have to return any voidcraft, vehicles, and supplies that was in excess of immediate and urgent demand. As the Primarchs were discovered and the legions established recruitment and supply infrastructure of their own around their adopted homeworlds, the supply and recruitment concerns for their mortal auxilia was soon a thing of the past. Over time, these solar cohorts became less of a Solar Auxilia cohort as more traditions and culture were imprinted on them from the legions they served, and as they became part of the legions' support and infrastructure. There were even specialized Astartes consuls in the legions to oversee these auxilia formations, aptly named Overseer. Another tiny bit of trivia that I found is that in 974 M30, the Imperial Court proscribed the Night Lords from inducting any auxilia forces due to their parent legion using psychotropic toxins on them. Although this was just a few decades before the outset of the heresy, so the Night Lords promptly ignored this ruling, of course. At this point they were more or less renegades anyway. Connecting the dots. What you have been listening to so far is me trying to stitch together all these little tidbits of info spread over these many sources, and from these I have come up with the following structure. At the top of the chain of command, under the somewhat joint rule of the Officio Militaris and the War Council, is the Excertus Imperialis, and under that is the Imperial Army, or in universe, Imperialis Auxilia, which in turn is comprised of roughly 3 different fighting formations: the Solar Auxilia, the elite troops, the crusading regiments, and the Imperialis Militia, although under local command. Besides the Imperial Army, the Excertus also encompasses a bunch of other miscellaneous roles, as I have listed on screen. We can also describe a typical compliance action of an expeditionary fleet with the knowledge gained through this research. First of all, the Astartes perform the initial conquest of a planet or system, supported by Solar Auxilia forces or possibly other Imperialis Auxilia forces. But for the sake of this example, a Solar Auxilia cohort. Once major combat operations are concluded, the Solar Auxilia secure what the Astartes have gained, freeing up the Legion to refit and move on to the next conquest, probably scouted by a pioneer force of Solar Auxilia in the service of a rogue trader or some other scouting force. The Solar Auxilia stay behind and aid the compliance effort, defending the planet and overseeing the raising of Imperialis Militia regiments that will one day be able to defend this new domain and possibly provide a surplus of fighting men and women for the Crusade itself. In the case of worlds with void expertise, new Solar Auxilia cohorts may be raised instead of or in addition to militia regiments. Once these are raised, the original Solar Auxilia force is then free to move on to the expeditionary fleet once again, unless they are to settle the planet, of course. For this sequence to make sense, either there has to be 2 Solar Auxilia cohorts assigned to each expeditionary fleet, like this, or the cohort has to be broken up so that part of it can stay behind and secure and raise the militia force, while the other follows the Astartes and supports them in combat actions. Although I think it is more likely that it is 2 separate cohorts, as we are told in a tiny blurb of information about the fleet that during the Great Crusade, the army and fleet functioned as a single entity, with army commanders exercising overall command of both elements. And we are also told that units are stationed entirely on board one void ship, so that if a ship is lost, a unit is not missing part of its capabilities or equipment. So it appears that they may not want to be broken up too much as a tradition during this time period. That is why I think it's 2 separate cohorts for this cycle to work. And that is of course assuming that it's a solar cohort to begin with. So what happens to all of this once we leave the Horus Heresy? After the heresy, much of the Imperium was reorganized and consolidated. Chief among these were the Imperium's fighting forces. As Guilliman broke up the legions into chapters so that no one man could ever again wield such power, so too were the mortal forces redesigned to be less powerful on their own in case of rebellion. This takes many forms, but a prime example is making regiments a more specialized formation, so that one regiment cannot easily mount an effective rebellion on its own. An artillery regiment would lack tanks and infantry, a tank regiment would lack the staying power of infantry, and a cavalry regiment would lack armored support, just as a few examples. Likewise, the size of the regiments were also scaled down from the massive sizes of some of the late Great Crusade era. The Imperial Army itself was broken down into the Imperial Guard, or Astra Militarum, as they are called in these copyright-friendly days, and the Imperial Navy, also so that commanders of ground forces would not also command the fleet to transport it in case of rebellion. The Imperialis Militia was more or less just given a new name, Planetary Defense Force. Lastly, a bit of a fun fact from the Imperial Guard 4th edition codex once more, and that is, according to the Tactica Imperium, the most widespread manual employed by the Imperial Guard, the inclusion of mutants and grav vehicles were outlawed after the Horus Heresy. So that's why we don't see either of those, I guess. Mind you, abhumans are sanctioned within parameters humans, such as ratlings and ogrins, so that's why they are exempt. I think that about wraps up the lore that I could dig up on this topic. This is by far the video that required the most research on my part, and making sense of all these tiny blurbs and how to connect it and tell it as a cohesive story. I hope you have enjoyed learning about it. If nothing else, I've certainly learned a lot, and even re-listening to some of the Siege of Terra books at the moment, I am enjoying a lot more of what is happening in the background when regular soldiers pop up. So I hope you got some painting done while listening to this, or just chilled out. If you're interested in more Imperial Army content, I will certainly be making more. There will be a little bit of a pause. Right now I am working on quite a few units for both my Imperial Fists and my World Eaters, so it's not that I won't be making any more of this, it's just that it's just a little bit lower on the priority at this moment in time, because I'm very hyped about some other stuff that I'm doing. Also, I think these guys turned out pretty cool, and I have a decently sizable force at this point in time. I do look forward to adding to it, I really do. But for now, I'm out. So thanks for watching, cheers.